everybody. You're listening to the Difficult Conversations podcast series with me, Poppy Gerrard-Abbott, PhD researcher and sociology teacher at the University of Edinburgh. And today we are tackling a really interesting subject. So we're going to be talking about the death positivity movement and death and grief in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm very lucky to be joined by our two guests. So the first is Harry, and she runs a Facebook page called A Positive Death UK. We will be linking that in below. And she also is generally interested in the death positivity movement. So welcome, Harry. Thank you so much for joining us. And secondly, we have Mandy joining us from Keeper Memorials and TalkDeath. So hopefully we're going to have a really lively and engaging conversation today. I'm just so excited to be talking about the topic of death, which, as you know, guests and listeners, is a highly stigmatized issue, which we need to be confronting during the pandemic, because we're seeing obviously very high levels of death and loss at the moment, but also people are experiencing grief in ways that they have never done before. For example, through socially distanced funerals and not being able to say goodbye to their loved ones because of the COVID conditions. So there's just so much for us to unpack today. So we will dive straight in. But before we do, I'd like Harry and Mandy to just tell us and tell our listeners a little bit more about you and your work and your message. What are you passionate about, and why have you joined us today on this podcast? Why are you interested in this topic?
Thank you for having me, Poppy. Death I've always been one of these people that's been fascinated with death, and how we have memorialized it, or how we memorialized it originally, through the ages. And Victoriana kind of held my focus for a long time with the memento mori and how elaborate the gravestones were in memorials. So I've always been somebody that's been absolutely lost in the world of death. But as my father, 3 years ago, was coming to the end of his life, I found the death positive movement, and to my surprise was discovering that there are new ways to say goodbye to those you love and to respect their wishes. And the more that I've dug into the death positive movement, it is about completely respecting the person that you're laying to rest or cremating, however they decide to go. And it's such an inclusive movement, and that you're looking to support everybody regardless of their journey to their last breath. It's something that touched me quite deeply at a time that I needed it to. So yeah, it's close.
Thank you so much, Harry. Yeah, I can tell that you come to this conversation and to the death positive movement from a place of real kind of personal experience in relation to your dad. So yeah, I can't wait to hear more about that. Thanks so much. And can you tell us, before we move on to hearing about Mandy and her journey, can you tell us a little bit more about the page that you've set up? So is this kind of a new venture? Are you still in the early stages of it?
It is in the early stages. I started that, as I said, when my dad died 3 years ago. It has been a bit of a hobby for me due to my work. I work in a completely different industry. However, it's allowed me to put some of my thoughts about natural burial to other people that are susceptible to the same idea that going through a very expensive funeral isn't the way we have to go. It doesn't have to be dictated to us in that way.
Well, we look forward to seeing the page develop more, and it's just great to be, communicating your thoughts and journey and ideas to the wider world. So thank you for setting up the page, and like I said, we will link that in below. So Mandy, are you ready to share with our listeners who you are and what you're doing here today?
Of course. Thank you so much for inviting me. So my story is basically in 2013, so almost 7 years ago now. I founded a website called Keeper Memorials, and it's basically a collaborative online memorial platform where friends and family can remember and celebrate their loved ones that have died. And they can do that with stories and tribute messages, photographs, videos, sharing their life milestones, all of those meaningful things that person brought to their life. And that was honestly just started as a project on a whim with an idea that I had with the co-founder of the company. And it grew, and my knowledge and my passion and my drive and my purpose really and everything I do completely shifted after founding this company. And so we work with families directly, but we also partner with cemeteries and funeral homes and hospice and palliative care centers. And our focus is really that every life has a story. And our goal is to help people tell those stories. And we were lucky to also work even directly with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And we are now memorializing on a new platform called Veterans Legacy Memorial, over 4 million veterans in 160 national cemeteries. And so the goal, once again, like in all the work we do, is to just help people memorialize someone and make sure that their life was never forgotten. And then from this Keeper platform, we started writing articles just on the topic of death and dying for Keeper. And it just completely evolved and became its own beast, as we like to say. And so we rebranded it from the Keeper blog to TalkDeath. And TalkDeath, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's essentially a death positive media site. And our mission is really to encourage positive and constructive conversations around death and dying. And we build resources about green burials and home funerals, funeral law, grief support. And we just write about interesting things like history and art and podcasts and movies. And a big part of that was having worked professionally in the death care sphere, and then working with and talking to just everyday people. I realized that there was a huge gap between the knowledge and people really understanding what their options are for the end of life. And similar to what Harry was saying, just there's so many different ways that you can do something that's meaningful for your loved one that isn't part of the, quote unquote, traditional funeral service. And so we really want to bridge that gap between death professionals and the general public, helping people make more informed end of life decisions, but also more meaningful ones. And this topic, definitely touches me just personally as well, from losing loved ones. And unfortunately, actually, my grandmother passed away just last week from COVID. And we went through that whole process of her having to pass away in a hospital alone, although my mother, against our wishes, went to be with her. And I'm happy she was there with her during her final moments. But we had to go through this whole process of having an online memorial service for her and doing this completely separated from our family. So I'm sure that's going to come up a lot, but it's been an interesting time, to say the least.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Mandy. That's just such a powerful way to begin, and I'm so sorry to hear that happen. But that is one of the major points of the death positive movement, isn't it? Is talking openly about these experiences and what you've been through, rather than shying away from it or not seeing it as appropriate for kind of normal conversation. And although we've only been speaking for a few minutes, I can see that there's so many different facets to the death positive movement. I thought it was just about kind of speaking, as I've said, just kind of speaking openly about death and dying. But actually, it's also about kind of breaking down the hierarchies between the different agents involved in the dying process. It's about kind of democratizing death. It's about, as you've said, Harry, challenging the corporatization of the death sector. So there's just so much to talk about. So my first question to kick off the actual discussion is around COVID-19. So, the elephant in the room is death and dying, I think. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been littered with negative images of death. So we've seen lots of narratives and coverage around bad death. So by that, I mean kind of sickness and suffering prior to death, the last moments of life being miserable ones. We've seen news coverage around mass graves, particularly in the US. The BBC and I'm sure many other news outlets have had these horrible kind of live update kind of functionality around death tolls, every minute updating with the amount of people that have died. Lots of kind of sensationalist coverage around less susceptible people, who are less likely to die of COVID, such as young people dying. Why do you think, Mandy and Harry, that this coverage is problematic from a death positive perspective? What do you think has been wrong or problematic with the ways that we've represented death in the kind of context of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely problematic, but I feel like I also have to ask another question, which is, when do you ever see a good death in the media? Unfortunately, the media is always sensationalizing tragedy because that's what gets views and attention and shares. And luckily, in the past few years, we have been seeing a really nice influx of stories about, modern community-based death care or green funerals, really all in the vein of this death positive movement that's been growing, but that's still really rare. But now I think the issue and the difference with COVID-19 is that we've been seeing these same images for over 2 months straight now. And I think personally it's problematic to be oversaturated and inundated with these images of death, not because death is bad and we don't want to see death, but because it actually risks giving us empathy fatigue. And I know that there's research about this in social science and the field of psychology that talks about the more we're presented with images of death and war and famine, the less we actually feel personally touched by these events. And I think that's really interesting. And it seems paradoxical, but it has the effect of further distancing us from the reality of death and feeling empathetic. And I think that this is something we're absolutely seeing with the elderly. And, I've heard firsthand people say things along the lines of, oh, well, at least it's only just the old people dying. And just that in itself is so problematic. So, all of a sudden someone is having to deal with losing a loved one firsthand. I think that these stories might also just only increase their fear of death and dying. So we have this difficult situation where we're seeing these images, and those images are so necessary so that people understand that real people are dying every day, especially because we're seeing a huge influx of conspiracy theories and anti-lockdown protests in the US, but also seeing too much of this can desensitize us to it.
Do you have anything to add to this question, Harry?
It's going on what Mandy said regarding it's only the old people that are going to die, or the those with underlying health issues. We seem to have forgotten as a group of people that it's those that are most vulnerable that we need to be looking after, and that's something that that sentiment can be applied to pretty much every part of our lives, our government, our social systems, how we look after the vulnerable in our societies has been neglected so badly that when something like this has happened, a lot of people are quite happy to put them first and throw them under the bus first, which is heartbreaking. I have a lot of friends who are immunosuppressed and are having to self-isolate, and the thought of losing them because people are quite happy to throw away the guidelines that are presented makes me angry. Um, Seeing those pictures on the screen on news reports are heartbreaking, and I've had to stop following certain media outlets on the COVID-19 situation simply because as Mandy said, it's too much. It's the oversaturation, to use Mandy's words, because I can't think of anything better, is going to generate more fear, especially within certain groups of people who are resistant to all the guidelines and the protocols that have been put in place for our safety.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, you mentioned fear. I've never seen the levels of fear that we're being surrounded by at the moment during the pandemic. Fears about this invisible illness, fears about the economy, fear, everywhere, fear about whether you or a loved one could die. There's, it's almost like this overdose of constant fear. So my next question is, how do you both think that we can live freer lives in this climate, in the climate of COVID-19? How can we use this as an opportunity? I don't know if that's the right word to use, to accept illness and death and uncertainty. I've been thinking myself about how can I use this time to actually become a little bit more accepting of the unknown and the fact that one day I will die. This is, for me, the message that I've seen kind of loud and clear and that I'm reading at the moment. I'm surrounded by all of this kind of death and fear, and how can I kind of carve out my own peace in that and live freer within the confinement of lockdown? Do either of you have anything to say about that?
I think the word uncertainty that you brought up is really key here. And I think that the reality that we have to talk about is that there is a lot to be anxious about right now. Just in North America, over 80,000 lives have been extinguished. People are dying alone inside hospitals and nursing homes. And because of these physical distancing guidelines that we have to uphold, people are left to grieve without a social support system. And it's important to realize that so many people are being affected by this. Unemployment numbers are dire right now. People are anxious about returning to work. Some people don't even have jobs to go back to. And so many families don't even have enough to eat. And so the question of, how do we live freer lives right now? I think trying to feel grateful and appreciate if you are in even somewhat of a secure situation. Do you have a place to live? Do you have enough income to eat? Are you healthy? And I think that if you use that energy that you may have pent up by staying at home, just try to support people who are in need of help most. Be that friend, support your local food bank. Anything you can do. I think, just being good citizens and being socially responsible and doing what we can to protect ourselves and others is unfortunately maybe the only way that we can live sort of freer lives in this climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with Mandy on that one. It's as working as a community, supporting those who are vulnerable and supporting local businesses who can provide the things that, especially if you can't go into a big supermarket for your shop, basics or not, if you can go to a local shop where they can assist you with the smallest part of shopping, that your necessities, then you're keeping a business and a family going as well as feeding yourselves and looking after yourselves. And I think that's quite important as well. It's looking at the bigger bubble, not just your immediate bubble inside the house. I think that's going to go towards helping alleviate a lot of their stress and do something. It'll do something for your own conscience as well, especially if you're you're supporting those you know you can support. Food banks, as Mandy said, rightly so. There's a lot of children in the UK who are getting their free school meals delivered while they're being homeschooled. There's I haven't seen much in the way of um, elderly people who are on their own being supported. It's not been very publicised. So maybe checking on an elderly neighbour, doing the little post-it notes through the door, asking them if they're okay, if they need anything collected, could also help. Um, so yeah, it's the little things I think that matter during a time like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people who live on their own have been really sidelined in many ways in terms of the ways that the kind of government has responded to lockdown policies, the ways that they've delivered lockdown policies. I think there's been a lot of insufficiency around caring for people who are living on their own, not necessarily elderly people. And those are groups of people who are suffering the most from lockdown policies. A friend of mine who lives on her own, who's actually young, said to me that she feels completely forgotten, even in kind of community work and community networks. Yeah.
And we're very fortunate that this has happened in a time that it's happened. We have modern technology to rely on. We can Skype people, and we can have video conferences, and we can use Zoom and all sit around with a cocktail or three and have a catch up with our friends and family that way. But as you said, it is important to remember those who are on their own, and those who don't have access to the technology as well. Not everybody has a smartphone, not everybody has internet access, not everybody can afford it. So this whole pandemic situation is, for me personally, is highlighting structures within it's becoming very political with how not just how it's being handled, but those who are being affected by it, those who are having to work the front line, those who are having to live who live alone and aren't being included. It's my brain can't find the right words.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And something that I particularly liked about your point just then was how you described COVID-19 as almost this microscope that has put every aspect of our lives and our economy and our communities, under a magnified lens. We can see all of the cracks so much better, and it's revealing so many things about our normal kind of everyday structures that maybe it's visibilizing the invisible. That leads me quite nicely onto my next question. So we're going to really kind of zone in on the death aspect of COVID-19. How do you think our psychology towards death has been highlighted as a result of the pandemic? I think that it's talking about this kind of microscope that I just mentioned. I think it's really revealed the scale and the depth to which we fear death. I think that the pandemic has almost performed our fear of death. How we kind of see it as really uncertain and really dark.
I definitely agree that the pandemic is, like you said, highlighted our death anxiety. And I think that it actually really makes me think of Sheldon Solomon, the social psychologist. And he talks about how humans employ risk management strategies to mitigate this terror of our own mortality. And so this terror management theory that Solomon talks about, under normal circumstances, we might push the thought of death out of our minds, turn to the life-extending promise of science, or we might join a gym. And that's all in an attempt to overcome our mortality. And when the risk is more direct, and when threats to our life are more present, say during a pandemic, we try to prove to ourselves that we're immune to death through even more extreme measures. And I think we're seeing evidence of these extreme measures every day. just by the fact that people are choosing to believe that they can't be or that they won't be affected by COVID-19. People are putting their trust in the easy answers like miracle cures rather than facing the reality that we're mortal beings. And for those who, believe and understand the realities of this pandemic, I think that some people may feel, as we talked about earlier, that this is something that's just happening. People may feel very removed from it, even though we are hearing about it 24/7. People may be, really pushing this to the back of their minds. But again, this is, a coping mechanism. And I mean, you can't really blame anyone for doing that during these situations.
No, it's the guilt culture that goes with I've seen a meme floating around. If you're not using this time during a pandemic to learn a new skill, you're doing something wrong. No,
Oh gosh, yes.
we should be using this time to evaluate, to grow and to heal. And that's another meme that I've seen floating around. And that one is the one that reflected with me more. I have really struggled with my mental health during this pandemic. Going from someone who could run 3 times a week to someone who has piled weight on and is only now starting to get moving again because I have to. So for me, it swung the other way. During dark moments, I was hoping it would affect me personally, so I didn't have to listen to it anymore. And that is a really dark conversation route to be taking this down, but it's something I didn't want to admit. It's seeing hyper productivity in people as a way of coping when my coping mechanism was something to step back, to hide, to hibernate.
I think what you've both outlined there, I mean, I hope that I've interpreted this correctly, and I think it's a really almost quite profound revelation to have, that maybe productivity and the hyper productivity that we engage in is a way of distracting ourselves from, from very legitimate things to be scared of, like sickness and aging, but it can also be a way of distracting us from this final end, which is death. I think that we do a lot to distract ourselves from our mind wandering that way, which is kind of, the final stage of our life. And we busy ourselves in ways that, to try and, not get ourselves to kind of think about it and confront these decisions. And
I definitely agree. And Harry, I definitely, what you said really resonated with me. And it is so interesting that we just turn to this hyper productivity state. And it definitely is a coping mechanism so that we just can forget about it and push it to the back of our mind. So as you were mentioning, Harry, kind of just doing the opposite and hibernating, it's almost a form of death positivity in a way. And I think that this is something that really brings up this major question, and something that is talked about in death positivity a lot, but maybe not in this light exactly, is that, when you're death positive, when you try to accept your own mortality, it helps you live a fuller life, right? And so when we think of a fuller life, I think that we think of productivity and accomplishing as much as possible. But I think that that's just a complete, that's just the capitalism in our brain that's talking, right? That your worth is your productivity. And I think that needs to be questioned.
That's exactly, what I was going to say, Mandy, that it's like this internalized capitalism and neoliberalism, isn't it? But I'm really excited to see what ways the pandemic can allow us to, and the lockdown measures can allow us to fundamentally challenge a lot of these structures that we've kind of got so used to, that we think that there is no alternative way of living. And I wonder whether, I have my fingers crossed and toes so hard that that we can actually learn something from this. I'm getting increasingly pessimistic, but I do hope that it can give us a glimpse to, another political order and to a different future, not just kind of in terms of party politics and the ways that people vote, but also the ways that people live their lives and the relationship that people have with death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that parents are having to homeschool their children, and it's got to a point now where children, although they're doing their work, are eager to get back into school. They're eager to learn. That could be because of the fact that they've had the social exercise and being able to go outside restricted, but they're eager and they're learning, and it's something that should be brought into life after the pandemic. Our productivity and our worth needs to be separated. We are worthy of so much more than that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Harry. That's such a powerful sentence that, we're worth so much more than that. And that's maybe something that we can use to live fuller lives, right? Thank you so much. So my next question is, and this might be a bit of a strange question, so don't worry if you need to take a minute to think about it. So in what ways do you think that we as a society are unprepared for death, disease, sickness, and pandemics? Is there something specific about pandemics we are unprepared for? I guess I would say that, again, with COVID-19 acting as this kind of lens or this microscope, it reveals just how frightened we are of sickness and aging and decay and death, even though these are all very natural parts of living. And even sickness and disease outbreak can be very, maybe, again, this is a wrong choice of words, but it's a very sad, but it's also a very natural part of life and living.
Yeah, I can start this one off. What I think that's really interesting about all this is that we're obviously, the most advanced we've ever been. Technology and science are improving and evolving at exponential rates, but there's still so much that's unknown. And what I think we're unprepared for is, really our healthcare systems and our social service systems aren't able to handle these huge influx of people in need of medical care. But I think, the worst part and fundamentally are, once again, this capitalism first mentality, especially when you're seeing the government financially assist these major corporations over extremely vulnerable and needy populations. I think that's just tragic. And I don't know if that has something to do with us as a society being unprepared for it. I think it's just a fundamental issue in the way we think about our vulnerable populations and what we really value as a society. And I think when it comes to mass death, something that we're unprepared for is also the danger of statistical probabilities. Basically, forgetting that over, I think, it's about 275,000 people that have died around the world of COVID-19. And that's a statistic. But what we don't talk about and what we don't realize is that number, that statistic is made up of individual lives that are now gone. And President Trump recently announced that he would consider it a success if 100,000 Americans die. And talking about these numbers in this way is, in my opinion, just a complete denial of death.
Mm-hmm. It's the same with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, quite proudly announcing that we've only had, I think it was something like 20,000 deaths to COVID-19, and it's disappointing. It is absolutely heartbreaking that we've had to hit that number when it was completely avoidable. It's evident of a system that isn't built for the people that are using it, that it's meant to be there for. We clearly aren't benefiting from the system that is in place. And it's not just those who, I mean, I'm very fortunate that I can work from home. My husband is an essential worker, so he still has to go out. He's not frontline, he's a mechanic, so he works with cars, he's fixing health contract cars, but he can still go to work. There are people who are very close to me who are working in supermarkets, they're working on the front line, NHS staff, and they're not being given the equipment they need, and then are being told to be quiet when they make a song and dance about it, which they have every right to talk about, but they're being refused their voice. That's what's getting me angry with how this is being dealt with, and the number of deaths that we're seeing, and the fact that the media are presenting it as a statistic and not as people, not as the people who are passing. We're not seeing the lives that are being affected by this virus. We're removing the humanity from it, and I think that's the scariest bit for me in how it's being dealt with. I mean, the media is questionable as it is, but we seem to be deliberately avoiding the fact that those who are vulnerable to it aren't being accounted for.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it's, going back to what we were talking about earlier with this oversaturation of death. And with that comes these statistics. And I have to admit, I was somewhat guilty of this at first when this was coming out, that, oh, okay, like it's a small percentage of people, this happened, it's terrible. And, I definitely had that moment where I thought in that way. And then I knew someone who lost their father. And then I knew someone who lost their aunt. And then my grandmother passed away. And there's people and there's lives behind every single one of those statistics. And it's really scary that sometimes you need to almost learn the hard way when you lose someone, that there's so much more to this than that.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, wow. I'm actually welling up a little bit. That's so powerful. I think that, going back to this kind of microscope that COVID provides us with, I think one of the most stark, observations from that microscope is about media and the ways that media shapes our language and outlooks, particularly around death. Yeah, it just becomes, you may have seen this, Harry and Mandy. I'm not sure whether you follow any British news outlets. I imagine US outlets are the same, if not worse. But the BBC News had this, literally this live death toll update that was almost like, I don't know, a countdown to something, that kind of thing. Or, literally you saw the numbers flicking around almost like a clock as death reports came in. And it was just so dehumanizing and so, unpersonalized. And as you say, just completely kind of sucks the humanity out of it. And I think it's such a cold way of delivering the news. And I think kind of stokes people's fear even more. And I suppose my next question is around history. So my question was, how can we link this pandemic to other pandemics? What narratives, language, and images are being recycled from previous pandemics? Probably obviously the most recent would be things like SARS and Zika and swine flu. But obviously the most historically significant in a European context would be the bubonic plague or the Black Death. And I think that the ways that we tell history also kind of pertains to this number counting, toll-like way of approaching death, we see the Black Death as, X number of people that died, and you have these images of kind of mass graves in your mind, and you open a textbook and you have these whacking great numbers written in cold black text, and there's very little on the lives that were lost, and very kind of few qualitative insights into, who were these people, who was more likely to die from the plague, and what did they do, and how did they live their lives? And do either of you have anything to say about that? How COVID-19 is can be linked to previous pandemics, or do you think there's anything kind of distinct and new about the narratives that are presented by COVID?
Definitely. I think that in general, in times of uncertainty, we try to find ways of making order out of disorder. And one way of doing that is to find that source of what's killing us. And the Black Plague, for example, without the knowledge of germs and viruses, their explanations for it were supernatural, or worse, they were of human origin. And Jewish people were unfortunately a natural target across Europe, and they were accused of poisoning the wells and spreading infections, and this led to huge massacres. And what's worse is that today, even with all of our scientific advancements and rationality, we find people ascribing blame in similar ways. Even today, Jews are continuing to be the target of these conspiracy theorists who even claimed at a certain point that Israel created COVID and that Jews are the ones that are benefiting monetarily. People are blaming 5G networks. People have been literally blowing up 5G towers. They're blaming aliens and government labs. And these are all really attempts to control this threat of, an invisible enemy. And I think something that's interesting as well, that the images that we are seeing that are very similar, just like when we saw, I'm not sure if you saw this in the UK, but there was this drone footage of mass graves being dug in New York. And the reality, something that's similar, is that for much of our history, this is how mass event deaths were really handled. But for those who aren't aware, the footage of those mass graves from New York is from Hart Island, which is just on Long Island. And this has been happening for over 100 years. Thousands of unclaimed bodies and bodies of the homeless have been buried there. So what's interesting is that these images are really similar to those we have seen from pandemics in history. And those images are being recycled, but it's still a reality that occurs daily. So sorry, I know I kind of just talked about a bunch of things at the same time, but I think that there's so much similarity between pandemics in history and what's happening today.
I was going to say, it's how we are eager to look for someone to blame, and the fact that during this pandemic, people seem to have let loose and are quite openly being racist about their responses and how they approach it. It's and I'm not just talking general public. People are the number of racist attacks on Chinese and Asian people have shot up in the UK dramatically. So, and personally, I find it absolutely disgusting. With regards to the mass deaths and how we are dealing with those mass deaths, it's, as Mandy said, it's not something new. It's how mass death has been dealt with over many years, centuries. It's convenient for people who have passed in large numbers to be buried or laid to rest the same way in one go. A lot of people who aren't familiar with this are going to be shocked by it. We have sterilized death over the last century, definitely, and how it's dealt with. It's gone from something that's been very home based with the care of the person who's passing, their after death care, and then the funeral. It's something that was taken out of our hands, and we were led to believe that it's dirty. It's something that we shouldn't be touching, when in fact that's not always true. We we can connect with the dead, not just as they're passing, but after they're passing. Um, the mass graves, for me, those images, it shows that sterilization of death. It shows that we've become separated from the person who's passed, and they have now become a statistic.
I think what you've both highlighted so well there is how this pandemic, as with all pandemics, are, they're often seen as, they're often kind of reduced to being, labeled as just a health crisis, but they're not. They're issues of racism, they're issues of economy, they're, it's economic, it's political, it's social, it's historical. Going back to your point, Mandy, about, these kind of Enlightenment ideals about scientific progression and about rationalism, I think that really does grip our approaches to death. And as you say, Harry, just kind of linking what you've both said there, you mentioned how we now distance ourselves from the dead, and the process of dealing with dead bodies has become this very scientific one and a very clinical one. And I think that really impacts and inhibits our ability to grieve, and compounded with the conditions of the pandemic, where people can't physically touch dying, perhaps the dying. And I think that has brought up so many issues to do with grief at this time, not just death, but also for, the impacts of death on the living, the processes of grief.
Yeah. And just to talk about what's different with COVID-19 today versus some pandemics in history, I think really has to do with, the internet and the fact that we're globally connected. And it's really interesting because mourning is sort of taking this new trajectory with, social distancing. So families are having online memorial services. And as mentioned, my grandmother passed away during this time. And, luckily I got together with my family and we put together a beautiful service on Zoom, and it was really meaningful. And to be perfectly honest, I think it was more meaningful than if we would have had a traditional funeral service, because it was completely just myself and my cousins getting together to talk about our grandmother and to honor her. And it was really, really beautiful. And so many people were touched by it. But at the same time, I think that because we are so connected during this time, if you're in mourning and you're alone, and because you have all of these connections, I feel like one can feel even more alone during this age of social media and hyperconnectivity, because you're thinking that I should be totally connected with people and I should be able to talk to people. But the reality is that when it comes to grief and to mourning, you can feel quite alone. And to be honest, a lot of people don't know how to reach out to you and don't know what to say. So when we talk about, especially in the death positive movement and in grief support, that you just have to be with the person. But what happens when you can't be with the person? I mean, sure, you could have a Zoom call and be on silent and, just be silent the whole time. And I'm sure that would be helpful, but it's still just a very strange time. And I think that that's extremely different than what than what has been experienced in the past.
It's wonderful to hear that there were positive aspects to, laying your grandmother to rest, and that it wasn't this really distraught experience, because I think that's another, downside to media representations of death during COVID, is that they're kind of homogenized to these really depressing horror story tales of death, grief, and, conducting funerals during COVID. But it's so wonderful to hear that you managed to find you managed to adapt, and then, find these moments of reflection and and all of the the whole spectrum of emotions that come with funerals and funeral rituals, you still managed to experience that, even if it was in a very, very different virtual format, which I can imagine was very, very stark. So my next question is, how can we try and navigate COVID-19 with a death positive outlook? I recognise that we've been on the podcast for well over the kind of half an hour that we plan to. We're now at an hour. So I've got after this one more question for you. We'll start off with, how can we try and navigate COVID-19 with a death positive outlook? And then I will finish up with asking you what message you would like to share with the public at the moment. And maybe with that final question, we will go like full circle back to your stories. Maybe share a little bit more about your stories of grieving, if you'd like to, and why you're interested in the death positive movement. But for now, can you answer the question, how can we navigate COVID-19 with a death positive outlook? How can we transfer that onto the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that it's a difficult question. And I think the best thing that I can say is that we need to learn to sit and meditate on death. Not literally, unless you're into that. I've never been good at meditating, but I think taking a death positive outlook in terms of not being dismissive of the elderly who are dying, and not being dismissive of those who are grieving the loss of an elderly loved one that has died during COVID-19, and to keep an eye on who is dying and be aware of your privilege. Because COVID is disproportionately affecting communities of color and lower income folks. And so I think that, again, being aware of all of that is all part of the death positive movement. And lastly, don't beat yourself up if you feel anxious or afraid. Death positivity, and there's a big misconception about that term. It's not about being happy about death. It's about learning to live with its reality in a healthy way. And so I think that's a really important way to navigate this pandemic.
Certainly, it's remembering that behind those who are being affected in the higher proportion of numbers, there are families who are in the background. There are people that they've had lives, they had stories, and remembering those stories, I think, is important. Understanding that going forward, we need to be mindful. Not everybody has the physical or mental ability to going back to what I said earlier, to be hyper productive. They haven't got the financial situation to be productive at home. It's a very confusing time, as I'm sure we're all aware. But death shouldn't be something that's whispered behind doors. It's something that should be spoken out loud, and so everybody knows what's happening, where they're going, what choices they've got in front of them. And a choice is something that's being stripped from people at the moment. You can't choose where or how you're going to pass at the moment. It's especially those affected with COVID-19. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. How we deal with the death after is something that we do have control over in a very limited way. But the fact that we do have the connectivity we do, I think, is very fortunate. Again, though, those people who don't have the connectivity, they're the ones that maybe we should be looking out for. We should be connecting with pen and paper just to reach out and check that they're okay. Not everybody is able to, as Mandy said earlier, to reach out. You can be surrounded by hundreds of people and be completely alone. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, don't you just hate that, how death is whispered about in the corner, and you can't if somebody's relative or close one has just died, and they attend, I don't know, a barbecue or a gathering or whatever, it's seen as socially unacceptable, as you're preparing food or having a drink or whatever, just to turn to them and say, I'm so sorry that happened, how are you doing? Everybody would give you the side eye, and it would be seen as a very quite inappropriate and sometimes even rude or overly confrontational thing to do.
Yeah. It's and this is something I've applied from personal experience. We found out my father had terminal pancreatic cancer in February of 2017. He'd gone into hospital in November of 2016, and my child was not. I think, how old was Kiddo? Kiddo was 11 at the time, just leaving junior school to go into comprehensive, and it was a hugely formative time in their life. However, I was not going to leave them out of what was happening and why it was happening. So every time I collected Kiddo from school, it was very much a case of, okay, so here's an update on Grumpy. That's what Kiddo called my dad. Grumpy's in hospital. He is yellow. His liver's not working as it should do. And with every step that we took, it was a case of, okay, look, this is what might happen. This is what's going to happen. And towards the very end, we brought the grandkids in to see my dad, as me, my mum, and my sister were part of the team. Look, we were round the clock in his palliative care towards the end. The last month, we would be in and out the hospital, just making sure the grumpy old sod was comfortable. But we brought the grandkids in and said, look, if you need to say anything to Grumpy, now is a good time to say them to Grumpy, because things are going to happen that aren't going to be very pleasant, and he is going to pass. Kiddo took it very well, and I think the fact that I was able to be as forthcoming, not just with the information, but with addressing the emotions around death and how we dealt with it as a family, I think that's definitely helped with how they've dealt with their grief. And for me, being able to talk to Kiddo and explain the situation, it was cathartic for me as well. Although I could talk to my mum and my sister about it, talking to Kiddo and explaining it to them in an age appropriate way it helped the little girl who was going to lose her dad, if that makes any sense at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Harry. I can imagine that was just so difficult. It's almost like we're not socialized to have the skills to create age appropriate or situation appropriate conversations or content on death, because we're not even trained to talk about death at all.
No.
So then to navigate the complexities and the nuances of, say, talking to your children about somebody in the family that's going to die, that can be such a muddled process that, where sometimes you actually have to think, right, what am I going to say to them? Because we're just not trained to have that vocabulary.
No, and I think I don't know if this is, I'm hoping it's something that Mandy didn't have to experience, but when people, the first words out of their mouths, they do the head tilt, the sympathetic head tilt, and then it's, I'm really sorry for your loss, but he had a good life, he's lived a good one, and his time was now, and
and he's in a better place.
And yes. It's just so frustrating. And I think, without going into too much detail, death isn't always pretty, it isn't always quick, and it can be extremely painful, not just for those going through it, but for those watching it. And to hear people telling me at the end of my father's life that, I'm sure he passed peacefully, and me not being able to tell them, well, actually, it didn't. I became very confrontational to people who were trying to be comforting and say meaningful words, but they were coming out with generic tropes that were crushing, if I'm honest. And it's those the things that we've repeated over generations and generations about loved ones who have gone, there can be sometimes the most insensitive things to say when somebody's just passed.
Yeah, just like how we need better sex education in our schools, we need better death education as well. And I think that
Definitely.
that would come with it. Yeah.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was you, Mandy, that said this earlier, that there's a lot of myth and misconception that surrounds the death positive movement, very similar to the sex positive movement. I've seen a lot of conversations that have made links between the two in terms of how they are needed, but also in terms of how they are perceived. And sex positive is often perceived as like everybody shag everybody and let's teach children about sex positions, but it's not that at all. What a misconstrued way to see it. And it's the same with death positivity, that it's seen as, you need to be positive about the death experience. But I think that is just such a what's the word, that really kind of fails what the death positive movement is. But death positive means accepting a full spectrum of possible deaths and a full spectrum of emotions that you may experience when death happens in your life. And if it was a slow and painful and gruesome death, that means talking about that openly and accepting that, as well as one that is peaceful. And I find that, a lot of people almost like force these narratives on you, don't they, when you're trying to talk openly about death. So, somebody asks you how you are and you say, oh, great, I've got an opportunity here. And then you share, and then they say something, as you both mentioned, along the lines of, or kind of synonymous to, oh, well, they're in a better place now. And I'm sure it was a lovely funeral or a lovely passing or whatever. And, actually, no, it wasn't. It was really horrific and really emotional, and we're now poor or whatever, you'd like to say back. And, so it's almost like that criticism that people often have of the death positive movement is something that they perform in their own lives and in their responses to death. They're the ones that are imposing such a response to death, not the death positive movement. That, you can only talk about certain forms of death, and you can only talk about certain aspects of it, and only the positive, happy parts of it. And words about death cannot exist in a conversation or in public space unless they are facilitating of other people, and unless they are, the most positive representation that you can come up with, which is often, tends to be quite a fictitious or exaggerated or manipulated description of what happened.
I didn't realize that death positive movement were seeking and helping those who the trans community, especially, and non-binary, gender fluid people, to have funerals the way they want. So their headstones show their chosen name rather than their dead name. The service talks about who they are as a person and what they've achieved, as most funerals do. But it also teaches and educates how the legal side of death can be seen and completed to support the person who's passed and their wishes beyond their grave. So they're being put to rest as they wished, rather than family is deciding, especially if those family are not conducive with who they are. If they're not happy with, I'm going to leave it there because my brain's gone blank.
That's okay. Mandy, do you have anything further to add before we move on to our final and closing question, which is, what message would you like to share with the public at the moment?
Oh, I'm happy to move on to that one. This conversation could be endless. We would be here all day.
Okay, fantastic. And as I said a few moments ago, this is really an opportunity, if you like, to take things full circle back to your own experiences. So, Mandy, recently losing your grandmother, and Harry, the story that of your father, which inspired your you researching the death positive movement and becoming as passionate about it as you are now. What message would you like to share with people who are also people in general, but also people who are losing other people at the moment?
I think that a message that I would like to share in this moment is to reflect and meditate again, whatever that means for you, on death, but to think about what you would want for your own death and for the death of a loved one. Talk to your family about it, have that conversation, and make a plan for it. Because, right now, even if you have a plan, it would go down the drain, right? As we know.
Mhm.
But luckily, this will come to an end, hopefully soon. And you can help your loved ones have the death that they would want. And having those conversations are so important, and having them in advance are so important. Something as simple as a DNR, a do not resuscitate. Is that something that you would want or not? And this is something that when my grandmother was in hospital, that conversation was had in that exact moment. And there was no talk, with her about it, because she wasn't in that state of mind where she could really express herself. And it was a debate that happened within the family, are we going to resuscitate or not? And having those really profound conversations will not only ensure that your loved one is having the death that they would want, but it's also so helpful for you as the family, being by their side. So, take this moment. Think about all these terrible deaths that are happening. Think about all of these people that are dying alone, and come up with a plan. It could be a simple plan where you just write out, this is what I would want, or this is what my loved one wants. And, write your will. Just get all that stuff done. We talked about being productive during this pandemic. If you can accomplish one thing and it's your death plan, then do that. That is what I would like to say. And, again, going full circle with my grandmother dying during this time, something that she would always say, and what we're actually going to be inscribing on her monument is "La vie est précieuse," which means life is precious. And I think that that's a very important message for everyone right now and in life in general. And it's a very death positive message that your life is precious and every life is precious.
Oh, that's so beautiful. So, are you a French-speaking family?
Yes, my family is French, but when they immigrated to Canada, we were sort of born and raised in a bit more of an English-speaking area of Quebec, which is a French-speaking province. So, we're essentially bilingual, but my grandparents only really spoke French.
And are you fluent yourself?
Yes.
Oh, amazing. That's just amazing. And yeah, what a beautiful, inscription to have on the grave. Absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, that really filled my heart with warmth. Beautiful. Yeah, I think that's such a salient message to take away from this discussion and from the pandemic, that life is just so precious.
Mm-hmm.
Enjoy it and live it to the full. And living it to the full does not mean constant hamster wheel productivity.
Yeah. You haven't got a trip to Disneyland, as fantastic as it would be. It's something, with life being precious and living it to the full. It's something that not many people can achieve without making some ridiculous sacrifices. So, that sentiment, life is precious. I think it's important to know that it's precious in any form. So whether you've done something, or you've just sat and allowed yourself to heal, you're still precious. You're still allowed to have that time.
Absolutely. Is there anything that you would like to say to our listeners, Harry? So what message would you like to share to finish up on?
Just, death is inevitable. It's going to happen. We're all going to meet it at some point. But knowing that you can choose what happens after, and that you can help your family after, I think is something that not many people are aware of. Even if it's writing little letters, or audio tapes, voice recordings to loved ones before you go. My dad sent a WhatsApp message to my mum, a very personal message that I was able to lift from WhatsApp and get embroidered on a t-shirt. It's the little things that
Beautiful.
we don't realize are possibly the last moments, but the fact that they're there, they're cherished. Knowing that, I think the other side of, as Mandy said, getting your death plan in place is the electronic side of things, the internet. Making sure that you know where you have accounts and your email addresses. So if somebody does have to be a legacy and close those down for you, that they know where they all exist, so you don't get some random package from Amazon 3 months after your father's died with false eyelashes. That was it's I think that's quite important as well. Facebook has a legacy option on their profiles now, so you can choose somebody to be your legacy, not your legacy, to take care of your account, so your account can be memorialized. And I think that is quite important now that we're having more of a presence on social media. It's something nice that if I see something on Facebook that reminds me of him, I can tag his profile in it and say, look, okay, this is you, this is how you would have you. It's nice. So
Oh, immortalized on Facebook. That's such an interesting concept. I mean, yeah, it could be a whole other podcast on this, right? How kind of like social media, the internet, AI intersects death, and we'll kind of reconceptualize our experiences of other people dying and ourselves dying as the future unravels. Oh, yeah, that's definitely something interesting to leave our listeners with. Well, for me, maybe if I answered this question, maybe it relates to what you were saying, Mandy, about meditating on death. People think that meditating is, sitting in the lotus position with your palms open and staying silent and not thinking about anything. But for me, it's kind of it's not necessarily that. I actually meditate on death quite a lot, throughout my kind of mundane daily life. I'll just be sitting and then I'll kind of think about, what is it that I want, and how would I like to be remembered? And even, I do worry about, but I think this is kind of a very, very normal worry or anxiety, but, at points it has paralyzed me in my life. What will happen when I die and after I die? And I haven't quite reached a firm position on or persuasion as to what I think will happen. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether I believe in an afterlife or not. And I think, but the death positive movement, even though I'm kind of not too integrated with it, but I have been exposed to its content, has allowed me to kind of sit in peace with the fact that I don't know about what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So before I felt like, I can't move on and accept death unless I know what's going to happen when I die. But nobody really knows. That's something that every person is in that position. Although, some people do grip to quite a kind of certain idea of what they think is going to happen when they die. But yeah, for me, death positivity is that we can lean into not knowing what that is going to mean. That's okay. It is all uncertain.
Yeah, definitely. I'm quite happy to look forward to being a mushroom farm.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Mandy. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say that for me, even just going back into the earth feels like such a perfect way to end my existence. And I'm happy to feed, although our bodies don't really technically feed the earth that much. The earth actually has to try to remove the toxins from our bodies. So it's kind of the opposite, which is interesting.
Oh God. Yeah.
Even though, that word, our bodies aren't actually full of toxins, but you know what I mean? Just the earth has to work towards breaking down our bodies. So once again, it's the earth doing all of the work for us, as it's always done. But I think that just thinking about just dissolving into the ground and becoming one with the earth is I think that's beautiful.
yeah, that's where my train of thought was going. Sorry to hijack, but yeah, I want to go full circle, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I totally agree.
Well, Harry, I found your proposition of being a mushroom farm to be very exciting, and I have been thinking about it ever since you first mentioned it to me. I'm like, do I want to be a mushroom farm? Maybe. Well, okay. I think we will finish up there. Is there anything else that you would like to say that's kind of sitting on your mind that you'd like to put into the podcast before we leave today?
I'd like to thank you for this opportunity personally, and thank you for reaching out.
Yeah, thank you as well. It was a really beautiful conversation to have, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about a lot of this throughout the day.
I know there's just so much, isn't there? We could literally just talk for hours and hours and hours. And so, yeah, coming across the pages that you both are involved in or run, and all of the other pages out there, just, you know, I've just been seeing them on my social media incrementally for like some time, and I'm just so grateful that people like the both of you have bothered to set up these pages and contribute to this movement for us all to benefit from. We all can benefit from the death positive movement and live fuller lives with an acceptance of death. So thank you very much to our guests, Mandy and Harry. I'll be linking in both of your pages and all of your work to the bottom of this podcast, so listeners, please do click on those links to find out more about what they do. Until next time, this has been the Difficult Conversations podcast with me, Poppy Gerrard-Abbott. See you next time. Bye everyone.